Welcome to the Moulding Health Show. Our goal is to leverage the wisdom and experience of healthcare practitioners to set you on a path of self-discovery and healing. These insights, coupled with a multidisciplinary approach to each area of interest, should provide an invaluable resource to everyone looking for a better approach to health. In this episode of the show, we speak to Lauré Coulter about bipolar and depression from a clinical psychologist perspective. Lauré Coulter, welcome to the show. So we're really glad to have you on board. And speaking about bipolar and depression from a clinical psychologist perspective, so really excited to unpack this with you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm excited to chat through these very important concepts.
Yeah, I mean, I'll always say, the pleasure is always ours. And, it's amazing that, we could get the buy-in from practitioners like yourself, and we obviously, there's something about the message, obviously, that makes sense because, I think everyone's quite excited about almost like unpacking these topics and, for the benefit of everyone listening to it. And, Shaz, unfortunately, is not in the show today, but I normally ask Shaz, how did she come, because she controls the scheduling. I normally ask her, how did you guys cross paths? How did she actually reach out to you?
Right. Yeah. So we actually met on LinkedIn, which I suppose is the modern version of running into colleagues. And, that's actually how we met. So it's actually lovely to connect that way. You find you have mutual connections and, share the same interests. So that's how that happened for us.
Oh, that's amazing. Hey? And it's interesting how active practitioners are on LinkedIn now. We have had some really cool guests, and and I watch them on the feed now because obviously we connect, as we will as well. And I watch them on the feed, and it's interesting. It's such a different world, hey, compared to like 10 years ago.
So true.
Yeah, my wife. So true. I remember when she started private practice, and many years ago, and I was busy telling her because I came from IT. Was here telling about websites, and she was like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, no, but that's how you find people. Like, you go onto LinkedIn and obviously exactly. 20 years later.
That's so true. And now it's almost unheard of if you don't, right? You have to have that presence, I suppose. So changing times that we live in, most definitely.
So let's go into it. Bipolar and depression. And I think, I know, we put that together. But firstly, I'd like to understand what is bipolar, for everyone, and also what is depression. I think we did cover depression in another episode, but it's interesting to kind of put those two together and kind of talk through it and understand from a psychologist or clinical psychologist perspective.
Perfect. Yeah, I do agree. I think that, you can't really understand bipolar very well if you don't understand depression very well. Both of these conditions are mood disorders, so therefore we are speaking about emotional state here. And, I think in order to understand bipolar, you really do need to have quite an understanding of what mania and hypomania is. But in the exact same breath, depression also features. I think we can kind of just go through that in a little bit more detail. It's important maybe to understand also the different bipolars that we do have. So we don't just have one general bipolar and that's it, even though I suppose in mainstream, talking, we do just refer to bipolar as bipolar, but in actual fact, you get bipolar 1 and you get bipolar 2. There's another condition also in the DSM-5, which is basically our manual, which they call cyclothymic disorder. It's not as common as bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, but it's also there. So we can go into that also in a little bit more detail later. But I suppose to start off, bipolar 1 requires the presence of a manic episode. And, there's often the presence of a major depressive episode too, but it's not necessary for diagnosis, if that makes sense. Most people with bipolar 1, though, would have manic episodes as well as major depressive episodes, and they could even have hypomanic episodes. I'll go into a little bit more detail what's the difference between manic and hypomanic episodes. But bipolar 2 actually has it actually needs one lifetime occurrence of a hypomanic episode, as well as one lifetime occurrence of a major depressive episode. So a major depressive episode has to be present in order for a diagnosis of bipolar 2. That's just kind of the gist of it. And I think I can go in some detail if you'd like me to, just, basically what that means.
Well, the first thing that sparks my interest is what is a major
Sure.
depressive episode? Just that I be
Right.
quite clear about that. And I know like there's, my brother went on a sabbatical and and then for years he never changed like homes, and then he was in a relationship, and then he changed homes and he changed like twice, in 1 year, and then he started reading up, and he was telling me, do you know the top 10 stresses that people struggle, like things would be like getting married, getting divorced, changing homes, changing jobs, and he's almost like he was checking off the boxes. So it's interesting. Is it something similar to that?
Yeah, you know what? There's definitely triggers in depression. So you ask a very important question. I think most of us, most of society is quite confused with, what is depression actually? And how do we know that we're in a major depressive episode or that we have major depressive disorder, which is actually quite different to just feeling depressed or going through a period of time where you have a low mood or a sad mood. So that's a really good example of maybe something that can trigger a period of heightened stress where you might feel a little bit more dysphoric than usual. But that does not necessarily mean you're in a major depressive episode. There's particular conditions that need to be met. There's like a duration of which you need to experience particular symptoms. It has to have a particular severity to it. And, in the DSM, what they would say over and over again for us to just kind of understand the difference is that it should cause clinically significant distress. That's when it would be a major depressive episode rather than just feeling depressed or going through a tough time, as well as an impairment in functioning. So, you might go through, as you say, those periods of time like divorce or moving to a new place where, you feel like things are harder than they usually are, but that does not mean you're unable to function. And, it probably resolves once the stressor goes away. So it's quite different in that sense.
Okay. And I think, this is the terms that, that I'm actually quite excited about talking about, because I think for the layman, like as in me, that are not used to the, looking at the DSM-5, even the terms that you just mentioned now. And I think we had an OT, Leslie Burns, where she dealt with, stress in the workplace as an example. And that's something I can relate to, because then, you see like team members, come from corporate for many years, and you see team members, they're not really functioning. You're not really sure why they're not. And you just see it on the performance. So it's interesting, when you say that. So from a clinical point of view, how would you know that someone is actually going through that depressive episode?
Yes, yeah. So I think what's really, really important is that you take a thorough history. There are many people who find themselves in a major depressive episode and who might appear quite okay, on face value. So I think in practice, what we find is really important is to go into the details, to find out which symptoms are present, how severe are those symptoms, and does it meet the criteria for a major depressive episode. But that we can only really do if there is, quite a focus on going in the details of what the person has experienced. That's when it becomes a bit more obvious. Look, there are times that people's depression can be more obvious, where they really do appear like they are depressed. You can almost see it in their body language. You can see it in the way that they talk, their energy levels. But I suppose most of the time it's really about exploring what it looks like for them. And there are specific symptoms that helps us establish this. For a major depressive episode, you do need 5 or more of these symptoms that I'm referring to. But there's a duration that goes along with that too. So let's say you just have a depressed mood for a day and it resolves right after that. Doesn't mean you just had a major depressive episode. But if you had a number of symptoms for a 2-week period in which those symptoms are present for most of the day, nearly every day, then, it's quite obvious for a clinician that you are in a major depressive episode, and a diagnosis is a little bit more easier to confirm.
Okay. And is it fair to say then the person is also not aware that this is happening? As in, they're not aware that these symptoms are as severe as it is, and it's other people that are looking at it that are probably looking at it and saying, actually, like there's not something right with that. You're not sleeping for like 3 days. That's not normal. You're not eating
Right.
and stuff like that. Is that right?
Yeah, look, it's not unheard of for an individual to maybe not be quite as in touch with how severe and how serious their symptoms are. But I would say it's not as common to maybe speak to an individual who's completely unaware that they are feeling depressed or that they are going through a significant period of time that's different to maybe their baseline level. If that makes sense. But oftentimes it is quite observable by individuals who know you well, who maybe live with you, and they see there's quite a big change from the person, from what the person would usually be doing. So you're right in that sense. A lot of family members would, for example, make a remark like, why are you so withdrawn these days? It's like you're just so demotivated, or this person is maybe, as you say, sleeping the whole day, or maybe not sleeping at all. So yeah, I would say some people do a really good job at hiding some of those symptoms, but others not so much.
And I think you said a really important point there, Lauré, which is other people around you know what the norm is, what the baseline is. And I think when they see you out of character, then those should be, the triggers. We were speaking about suicide as well, which is hectic topic, very prevalent in the last few weeks in South Africa with some of the media personalities, I think. But those things, I mean, normally people around them can pick that up, can say, actually, that seems out of character. The person doesn't normally behave like that. And I think those would be the warning signs, to say, okay, should we be assisting maybe more?
Definitely. Yeah.
I like
You're right.
I like how we came down the, like almost the depression route. And I want to ask this because I'm not sure. But, we spoke about, we spoke to many practitioners from, young children perspective, and they always talk about, like coping mechanisms and stuff like that. And that's what builds up almost this resilience, like around that. Do you find that people without those coping mechanisms or that resilience, are they more prone to those major depressive episodes?
Yeah, as far as what research tells us, resilience or factors that go into resilience actually really does help, for the prognosis, for instance, of a condition. So these factors could be, just as you mentioned now, coping skills, high levels of self-awareness, more balanced, healthy lifestyle, for instance. So I suppose it's quite true that you would find if people haven't really developed a lot of those coping skills, they might not have that thing that they can kind of fall back on. They might not always be aware when they are, entering into a major depressive episode, or they might not always know what to do to prevent it coming on more severely, if that makes sense. So let's compare it to someone who's had some time to build up coping skills and to work on their resilience. They might be able to identify their triggers earlier on. They might be able to activate social support systems a little bit more quicker and more effectively. And all of those things are what we like to call protective factors. So definitely, I think that's also where therapy comes in. It really does help with that side of things. It doesn't mean that, let's say, you'd be able to sidestep a major depressive episode entirely, but I think your experience of it, and maybe your likelihood of going into it, would be eased a little bit.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Not that we're going to close up the depression part, but can it be cured? I mean, is it, so once someone has been diagnosed with it, is there like a good prognosis around like getting better?
Right. So, this is actually a question that we get quite a lot, and it's such a good question because I think anybody who's diagnosed with a major depressive disorder does want to know how long are they going to have to live with this? What is the course of this going to look like? And can it be cured? Can it go away? I think, unfortunately, when we look at it from the angle of being cured, it does imply that it's something that just goes away and you never experience it again. And, it's like magic kind of disappears in the air. And unfortunately, that's not the case with mental health in general. But it doesn't mean that, depression is something that you're going to be saddled with and it's just going to get worse and worse with time and you're never going to be able to manage it or treat it. The course of depression is quite variable. So you would find people, and this is not unheard of, who's had, let's say, one episode of major depression, and they went on the right treatment, they did all the stuff that they possibly could, and they could live years and years without having another episode. Then again, you find other people who, have recurring episodes of depression, and they have to stay on treatment much longer, and they have to, really put a lot more effort into it. So depression can definitely go in what we sometimes call remission, which means there's a two-month period where symptoms are not present and you can see this person is really improving. So it's not necessarily the type of thing that you should think of as, this ultra chronic, going to be there forever. But you also kind of have to be aware that you can have an episode in the future, and you do need to be, quite in tune with how to prevent that, how to, remain in treatment and really improve your chances prognostically.
Okay, I like that. So we're going to go into bipolar, and I always try to relate it to something. And for me, I don't know if you ever watched the series Homeland. So Claire Danes, she plays a CIA agent, and she's bipolar, but she's so driven in the series, and and there were certain stints where she's off her medication, and she's like you can see the clear difference between her being on the medication and not on the medication. And only later on, in the series, you get to know actually she's got bipolar, and that's why she acts so erratically sometimes. So really interested, to see how that stereotype, in my head, kind of is different, with bipolar. So maybe take us through that.
Yes.
So obviously, someone
Sure.
is now diagnosed with bipolar and whatever severity that was. What can you expect, or what how do you explain that?
Yeah, sure. That's such a good example. I think it's so good that you bring this up, because one thing that I think we're exposed to quite a lot, which is not necessarily a bad thing, is depictions of the condition, in TV series, in movies. We're seeing it more and more as time goes on. I think they're doing it a little bit more justice these days than they used to in the past, because, as you say, there can be quite a bit of a stereotypical view of the condition. But I think for the most part, they can get it right. Look, bipolar looks very different in different individuals who are diagnosed with it. So you might find individuals whose functioning is very much impaired. They just, like, it kind of looks like it can never improve, like they're all over the place. And you get other individuals who are very well functioning, and you almost won't know they have that diagnosis unless they tell you, or unless, as you say now, let's say the person is off of their meds and these symptoms come to the forefront. So yeah, bipolar is a tricky one, and it's one that's also unfortunately stigmatized quite a lot. I find that a lot of clients are afraid even of getting a diagnosis of bipolar because of people not really understanding what it means or what it's like. many people, for instance, think it's a choice, that people go into this, let's say, mood swings, and they just can't control themselves, and they're difficult to be around, etc., etc. There's a lot of, that type of blaming, and, seeing these people as just highly dysfunctional, etc., etc. And I don't think that's very fair. So maybe to give a picture of what bipolar is, the main feature that distinguishes it from depression, as we said earlier, is mania, or a manic episode. And a manic episode, just basically in pure language, means that there is a distinct period of time in which a person experiences excessive levels or abnormal levels of elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. And along with that, there's also an increase in goal-directed activity or energy. And in order for a manic episode to be diagnosed, this has to occur for at least 7 days. So once again, there's that duration aspect of it. Let's say a person is in an elevated mood for a day and they just seem happier than normal and everyone thinks it's strange. That does not mean they're in a manic episode. This also has to be present for most of the day, nearly every day. And I'll go through a little bit like what the symptoms are. There's 7 main ones. Just to bring in again the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. In bipolar 2, there's of course a hypomanic episode, not a manic episode. If ever you've had a manic episode, you'll get a diagnosis of bipolar 1 rather than bipolar 2. So a hypomanic episode in bipolar 2 has all the same symptoms as a manic episode, but the duration is a little bit less. It's 4 days instead of 7 days. And there's not a hospitalization, for example, necessary. So it's not as severe. The impairment in functioning is not as severe. So the mania aspect of it basically is not as severe. So yeah, maybe I should go through those 7 symptoms to make it a little bit more clear if
Yes,
you'd like
please.
me to.
Yeah,
Sure.
definitely.
Sure. So basically, in order to meet the criteria, if it's an elevated mood that you're seeing in the person, they need to have 3 of the 7 symptoms that I'll list now. But if it's an irritable mood, which also often occurs, they need to meet 4 of the symptoms, or, experience 4 of those symptoms. Firstly, you'll find in people who are having a manic episode often an inflated self-esteem or a sense of grandiosity. So I don't know if you've ever met someone who just seems very confident, like they own the world, they just seem to have what we in psychology language always refer to as this grandiose sense of self. So it can range, honestly, anywhere from just being excessively self-confident to even delusional states of grandiosity. So if someone has a little bit more of a psychotic feature in their bipolar 1, you'll find that this symptom appears to be, very kind of out of touch with reality. Someone can say that, they believe they're going to be crowned as the next Queen of England, or that, they have the cure for all of these incurable illnesses. It's that type of picture. It can range anywhere, between that.
I was going to ask you, does it
yes.
happen in the IT industry a lot more common? Because definitely there's a lot more people that I worked with, coming from that industry that believe that they can solve everything. But I think you kind of reframed it when you said, Queen of England. Obviously, I didn't hear that.
Right.
But,
Yes.
definitely in the IT industry, people think that they can do whatever, You're almost like trained to, especially when you get to pitching to clients and stuff like that, you want to tell them that stuff.
Yeah, that's
Quite
very
funny.
true. Hey, that is quite encouraged, let's say, in certain professions like that. You need that self-confidence, that overt, I suppose, positivity that you're going to solve everything. But yeah, definitely in bipolar, you see it's quite more severe and quite out of touch with reality, where maybe a lot of people have reason to be overly self-confident or not. So that's a very important point that you bring up.
I had a manager, and like in my mind, whenever you think of confidence, I have him in my mind, and he always said, I'm so good. There should have been two of me, and I mean that summarizes that
Yes.
confidence part.
That's a very good summary of it. Definitely. The next one that is almost always present in bipolar is a decreased need for sleep. So individuals who are in a manic episode very often have very little, if not complete zero need for sleep. So it's different than what you'd find in a depressive disorder, though. If they're in a depressive episode, they might struggle with sleep, also not get a lot of sleep. But in a bipolar individual, they actually don't want that sleep. They feel like they're rested, like they have all of this excessive energy. They can literally go days and days and days without resting, where the insomnia that you see in a major depressive episode is not accompanied with that excessive energy. That person is tired, but they just are having difficulty sleeping. So I thought it's just important to bring up that key difference. Unfortunately, in bipolar, the more this person, resists resting, resists going to sleep, the worse it often does get. So this symptom is quite an important one, quite a big one. The next one that I think more people would be familiar with is pressured speech, or when an individual is more talkative than usual. So often if you see someone in a full-blown manic episode, you'll find it's very hard to interrupt them while they're talking. So they are just nonstop, verbalizing what's on their mind. Very, very difficult to interrupt, and often very difficult to make sense of. So I don't know if that's something you've experienced before, but it's quite obvious to an observer that this is very different to normal, communication.
And is that for 7 days? Like the same thing, the symptom for 7 days?
Yes. So if the symptom is present, then yes, that would be for a large portion of those 7 days, but you would get people in a manic episode who might have this particular symptom missing, but they have enough of the rest. So it is quite severe, and it goes on quite long, and, very few breaks in between.
Can you get the flip of that, Lauré? Can you have like people don't speak for 7 days? Is that, or is that only if they speak too much?
Not necessarily in a manic episode. No, not necessarily in a manic episode. That's quite uncommon, I would say. You wouldn't really expect that then. Just because, they have, which is actually the next symptom, a flight of ideas, so their thoughts are racing. It's very uncommon, I think, for someone to not really verbalize that if they've got that flight of ideas, or not speak at all. Maybe I would say that would be more a feature of a depressive episode. So you could be in a bipolar 1, or have a bipolar 1 diagnosis, but let's say you're in your major depressive episode rather than your manic episode. And there you might not be talking as much, you might withdraw more. It would be a more typical picture there.
Okay, that makes sense.
Sure, yeah. The next one, other than the flight of ideas, which is quite common, is distractibility. So it's more than maybe just someone who's not listening to you while you're talking. It's quite excessive, and you find that it's very difficult for people who have this symptom to follow instructions. It's like they're not quite there. Feels like they're in a different world. So distractibility definitely goes above and beyond the normal level. And it just, I think makes a lot of sense when we think of the flight of ideas symptom. There's just so much going on internally. And then I'll just mention the last two. I think the second to last one, which is an increase in goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation, is something that a lot of people would actually see. So they show this symptom quite a lot in movies and so on, where the person might be pacing quite a lot, they're engaging in all of these different activities. Their level of engagement, so to speak, is just much higher than normal. You'll find that they take on random projects, that don't quite make sense. Why are they onto this thing now? Or, it can take place in any sense, sexual activities can increase during that time. And there's also a feature of restlessness often, which is what they mean with the psychomotor agitation. So that pacing, never quite feeling like you can just kind of chill, if I can use that word, is quite a big feature. And then onto the last one, which I think is something that is also often depicted, is that there's excessive involvement in activities that have, let's say, disastrous outcomes, or that could potentially have disastrous or painful outcomes. You'd find that people who have this particular symptom are all of a sudden, let's say, going on these massive spending sprees, and they are maxing out their credit cards, and there's no real concern or insight into what the effects are of what they're doing. There's almost this overly optimistic like background to it, like it's fine for me to give all of my money away, it's not the biggest deal. Or there's sexual promiscuity, also not a lot of maybe insight into what the effects of that could be. People gone to gambling excessively, racing down the driveway, or and everyone else around you is thinking, what on earth is going on? And I think this is probably one that's depicted quite a lot in movies and TV shows.
So would you say that activity is more like high risk activities? Would that be a way to put it as well? Okay, cool.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, definitely high risk. So oftentimes you would find that people get themselves in quite a bit of trouble, for that very reason.
So now again, I'm going to come back to Homeland, and so with with the character, Claire Danes' character, Carrie Madison, she actually took herself off meds because she knew that she almost like wanted these symptoms. So she wanted, because she was a CIA agent, so she wanted that ideas part. So when you say this, because it got her to think of like all of these other ways that she could almost like find the fugitives and stuff like that. So it was quite interesting. So and then she almost knew, but it was later on in the series, she almost knew that if she came off the the meds, that these other things would happen. And when I think about it, the one time, she left her little daughter with like a ex like military veteran, and everyone's like, how can you do that? Because that's such a high risk thing, and stuff like that. Definitely the sleep. I didn't hear you mention anything about eating, but like with her as well, she didn't eat a lot. Like she would not eat. Would that be anything close to that as well?
Yeah, I think it's definitely related. It's not specified on its own in the DSM, but it's definitely not uncommon for it to be a feature as well. I think because of the distractibility and because of the fact that there's that excessive increase in energy, it can be very similar to the decreased need for sleep. You just feel like you can continue going on, without those important, I suppose, aspects that keep us, energized and maintained, like food and sleep. So it's very true what you're saying. And it's I suppose a very important thing actually to explore what you bring up with this character, that often individuals want some of the symptoms, or at least what the symptoms bring for them. What I find is that there aren't many people who would probably take that risk just, for those positive consequences, or let me put in inverted commas, positive consequences. but it's not unheard of. People do find, maybe especially more in a hypomanic episode where it's still the same symptoms but not as severe, that it doesn't trouble them as much. It's not as distressing. They like the fact that there's a lot of creativity and freedom that comes along with that. So they might not want to suppress that. It's very true what you're saying. It does happen.
Okay. If Shaz was here, she'll probably put some superhero connotation to it because we're big into that. And so when we spoke about ADHD, that's what we said. It's almost like these superpowers that you have, and then you choose when to use it and when not to use it. In this case, it's almost like those are, it's probably there. So in her case, she chose, like I actually want those superpowers right now. And there's obviously a risk, it's like Hulk, like obviously when he goes all ballistic, he knows that he's going to damage stuff, but he knows that he has to do that stuff. So yeah, interesting.
Definitely. Very true.
I can't help bringing up the topic of the drug correlation though, because like, all of these things that you mentioned, I mean, there's like people that are on, like drug addiction. Doesn't this come up like isn't there like an overlap at some point, like around this stuff?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Addiction is such a, I would say a common feature really, generally in mental health. I think we see it all the time, but especially when this person has a condition where insight is impaired, judgment is impaired, or they might just be purely looking for a way to self-medicate. A lot of people who go onto drugs for whatever reason might feel like in their frame of mind, it's helping them manage what they're going through, even though it's definitely not doing that. It does play a role, and it does come in. I think, let's say for people who have a diagnosis of bipolar 1 disorder and there is that engagement in more high-risk activities, they're not always considering the consequences of that. So drug use, just comes and it messes up the whole picture, when we think about this prognostically. If you want to be on your treatment, but you're also abusing a substance, you're just making your life, I think, a lot harder for yourself. It's very difficult though, because you'd find in the DSM also they always make provision for manic symptoms to actually come from a substance in itself. Let's say a substance use disorder, a particular substance that might actually bring some of those symptoms about. So that's something quite different than a pure diagnosis of bipolar 1. That would be more if a person only experiences those symptoms once they've been intoxicated with a particular substance or they're in withdrawal of that substance. But it goes away when they're not on it, for example. And that's how it's different. You can have a person who has bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 and they've never touched a substance in their life. But yes, this is unfortunately a very common feature, especially these days. I would say since the pandemic, people are just looking for all types of ways to cope, and that always forms a part of it.
It's interesting that you say that, because like in my wife's practice, I mean, there's quite a few like of insurance related stuff, but it's actually interesting that the insurance companies, I don't know if you find this as well, but they're asking for medical records a lot more than they used to probably 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And I thought that's quite interesting. It's like a new thing we're seeing as requests for those. So it could be something similar to, what you're saying. Coming back to the drug one though, and I know I'm pushing this a little bit, but can drug abuse maybe, and there might be no research that correlates on this, but it's just curiosity from me, because I mean, I always think, like as teenagers, if you start on this drug abuse, route, is that more likely then to give you bipolar? I mean, I think that's what I'm asking, and it's more your thoughts on it. I'm not sure if there's any research to correlate that.
Sure. Yeah, you know what? I think we can definitely say that it is always a risk factor. So maybe to answer your question in that light, we look at risk factors in any mental health diagnosis, and substance abuse is always one of them. So it does increase your risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who abuses a particular drug, might have that outcome or might become manic or, have any other mental health condition. But if you already have a predisposition for it and there's other risk factors that come together, you using a substance can definitely increase your risk of developing bipolar. As I say, if the substance was the only reason, let's say, for example, this person develops those manic symptoms, but it goes away the moment they're not taking the substance, then that doesn't mean they have bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. They have a very particular diagnosis called substance-induced bipolar and related disorder. If that makes sense. But you can develop bipolar 1 having, one of your triggers being substance use, but you can be sober, off of your substances for, let's say, a year or more, and those bipolar symptoms have not gone away. They're there to stay. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It gets a little bit complex, but I suppose, when we look at it from the angle of risk factors, most certainly.
Okay. I mean, like, again, in my corporate days, I came across quite a few individuals, like, that were on the hardcore drug, stuff. And I mean, they would have stories of like staying up for like 4 days and, like partying for 4 days. And I was like, how do you do that? So when you're talking about like this, and you're saying 4 to 7 days, I mean, I would say, like there's definitely drugs that seem to, give them that same, same way of like being at that level. Because that seemed very excessive for me. I mean, I'm a sleep type person, so like, can't deal without sleep. Well, I did it once or twice, when it was work, and not sleep for like a day or so. But I can't say like 3 days or 4 days. I mean, that just doesn't seem right.
It does. Hey, you're right. It does seem so abnormal and so severe, and not something that I think any of us biologically should be attempting, so it really does just show you the impact that a lot of substances can have on you, so yeah, I suppose the moral of the story often is just, try avoid it if you can, because, you are messing a lot with your biological symptoms, and the presentation of this can be so much worse. So it's very true.
Pushing this a little, from another angle, do you see any correlation between like ADHD and like bipolar? Is that a thing?
Yeah, you asked such an interesting question. Actually, I think if I remember this correctly, the DSM even, when they speak about comorbidities, they do even mention that ADHD is not an uncommon comorbidity with bipolar. So this is where it gets tricky. You can meet all of the criteria for bipolar as well as all of the criteria for ADHD and have both of them. Or you can have symptoms that are overlapping and it seems like it can be one or the other. And let's say you can be misdiagnosed and, someone or professional tells you they think it's ADHD, and later on it becomes a little bit more clear that it is bipolar, it's more manic episode that we're looking at. Look, I don't think it should be that confusing. Clinicians shouldn't be getting it wrong all the time. But there are symptoms, I think, that can look very similar to one another, especially because of what I imagine to be that energy aspect to it, as well as the cognitive aspects, such as the distractibility and the flight of ideas and the pressured speech. In ADHD, you can definitely see people, also jumping from one topic to the next and not remembering what you just told them, and very, very distractible. But you don't necessarily see all the other stuff like grandiosity, the high risk behaviors. Though the decreased need of sleep, I also don't think is quite a big feature of ADHD. So yeah.
Interesting. And would it be fair to say then maybe with ADHD it's more consistent, you know what you're getting all the time, whereas it seems like with bipolar it's erratic, there's these episodes that kind of come up and you're not really sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. That's such a brilliant way actually of looking at the distinction, because in any mood disorder like depression and like, bipolar 1 or 2, it's distinct episodes, and those episodes occur, as we say, for a particular duration, like at least 7 days. It's not as pervasive, there's moments in between where you go back to baseline. So you're spot on, ADHD is more pervasive. It is the baseline, so to speak. Those things don't represent a massive change from what you see in the individual on a daily basis. It is more or less what you do see from the individual on a daily basis. So it's a very good way of actually making that more clear in how we understand it.
Okay. Great. And same, that I asked around depression. Can bipolar be cured? And I think you can include if you can. I know obviously psychologists can't prescribe medication, but like I said, with Carrie Madison in Homeland, she had, I can't remember, was it lithium? But she had something, some tablets.
That sounds right. Yeah,
that she had to take, and it almost like was a chemical reaction, that she needed in the body. Is that something? So firstly, can it be cured? And secondly, can it be managed with medication?
Sure. Yeah, look, this is such an important point actually, because very much the same as we mentioned with depression, there is no cure for bipolar. It is a chronic condition. I think most clinicians who speak, to a person about bipolar and they help psychoeducate about it would always want to drive the message home that it is chronic. It is a lifetime disorder, meaning that for the rest of your life, you're going to have to be aware of the fact that you've had a manic episode, that you carry a risk of having another one, and it isn't necessarily what a lot of people actually would think it is if we say chronic, in the sense of, this is going to debilitate me for life. It's a life sentence. I can never live without the distress that it's causing me. That's not true. A lot of people who have bipolar actually live very, very functional lives. They can be healthy, they can be happy, they can be in meaningful careers, they can actually experience, all the range of emotions and experiences that any other individual would. But I think it is a little bit more of a, let's say, taking responsibility thing, knowing that I do need to, just as you mentioned now, I do need to go onto, a treatment regime of sorts for this. And it involves a number of different things. It's not just medication, even though medication is very important. You would usually say to someone who's had a diagnosis of bipolar that you need to try and treat this as soon as possible. Go to a psychiatrist, share with them what you're experiencing, and try get on treatment as quickly as you can. And then, you go through a process with a psychiatrist to really see what works for you. So yeah, mood stabilizers definitely come up. It's like you say, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't really say any of this in detail, but mood stabilizers are definitely a part of that. I think it depends very much on how your bipolar has manifested, what type of bipolar you have. But the quicker you can get this treated, the better your chances are prognostically that you can get this under control and you can, go back to functioning that is just a little bit more healthy, just a little bit more, I suppose, I don't want to use the word normal, but what you would describe as your own normal functioning. So that's kind of a summary of it.
I know with kids as well, like that term normal, like I think with the whole sensory integration, now it's like, what's it?
Yes.
Neurotypical and diverse. It's like
Yes,
those are the terms. So yeah, we don't say normal, which
exactly.
is
Yeah,
quite
no, we
funny.
must refrain from that
Yeah,
term.
yeah,
I
exactly.
do agree. I always say to my clients, I don't know what normal is. Someone must come and define this to us. So very true.
That's a good way to put it. On the medication part, again, this is more my own, like let's say stereotype, again, fed from media. But for ADHD, it seems to be that it's not mandatory, but probably important. As in you could go on it to manage it, but you don't necessarily have to be on it. With bipolar, is it the same? Is it important but not mandatory? Because in my head, I got it that it's mandatory, for people with bipolar to be on medication.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say it's definitely one of those things that you can't really look at it from the angle of, I can kind of just be on treatment if I want to be, or if I feel like it. As you say, maybe with something like ADHD, it's not as mandatory. And, you go on medication when when it's necessary for you to manage your symptoms optimally. In bipolar, it's almost always necessary, to be on medication for you to manage your symptoms optimally. So I would say it's quite dangerous when people think about it, that you can just kind of hop on and off of these medications as you'd like to. That's when we start seeing that the course of bipolar becomes a lot more messy, and people have a lot more difficulty in that sense. So yeah, I mean, it sounds horrible. A lot of people don't want to think about it this way, like, okay, so I have to be on medication. But it's important to remember that psychiatrists are very well trained in this. They don't want to saddle you up with a bunch of medications that you just feel drugged all the time. They really do want you to feel like you've got a lot of freedom to just live an optimal and a healthy life. And medication does form a part of that. And, yeah, I think as long as you go for regular check-ins with your psychiatrist, they can change your dose, they can help you as you go along. Nothing is necessarily set in stone as this, what I said earlier, this life sentence that just, is going to go downhill from here. Definitely not. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. And again, I'm thinking back about those insurance reports, and from what you said so far, especially with the episodes, and I think anyone listening to this, and one of the reasons for doing the show is to almost like shed light on some of these things, so that if you do get that diagnosis, you need to understand what that diagnosis means, and probably
Definitely.
how like other people are going to perceive it as well. And when I say other people, I mean companies like insurance companies and stuff like that. So I'm
Yes.
not sure if people understand that stuff as well, so that it's
Mm.
very easy to get the PMB sessions
Mm.
for 15 sessions from discovery for a year
Mm.
for a certain diagnosis. But once you get that diagnosis, there's probably knock-on effects, and I don't know what that
That's
is,
right.
but I mean, I'm just saying, that's
Yeah.
stuff that we seem to be picking up right now that didn't seem to be there 5 years ago. And for
Mm.
whatever
Mm.
reason, like you mentioned, the pandemic and stuff together, I don't know if what
Mm.
that knock-on effect is. So I think
Absolutely.
for me, what I take out of it is that it's like you said, lifelong. It can't be
Mm.
cured. The episodes, you can manage it, like you said,
Mm.
but the
Definitely.
episode could still happen. And I think from a risk
Mm.
point of view, insurance companies do want to cater for that somehow, I suppose.
Mm.
But it's always important to be almost honest about where you are and how you're feeling, and what you can do
Definitely.
and manage it and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is such an important topic, and I think we'll probably have conversations like this in our profession, over and over again, because it is changing. I think as a lot of corporations are also becoming more aware of mental health and what it's about, I suppose two things are happening. In the one sense, they are becoming smarter about it, more informed about it, and stigma can go down. But in another sense, I suppose they can also maybe start bringing in more restrictions, and stigma can kind of, just continue forth in a different way, So a lot of people can zone into, let's say, one symptom like that high risk part that we spoke about, and, put a lot of focus on that. What does that mean for insurance claims, etc., etc. And look, I don't think it's always fair, but it does make sense, why these things matter more than they would in the past. And I agree with you. I think people should just be very, very honest about their condition. Luckily, the trend that we're seeing is that people are understanding it more. People want to understand it more. And, I think the more we're really open and honest about it, and we're able to tell even our workplace, if we want to, what we're suffering with, the better it will become in the long run. We do have to keep ourselves informed, and, just continually actually psychoeducate ourselves about these things that exist. Because I suppose that is the only way we're ever going to get to a better place, with mental health.
Right. Yeah, definitely with people like yourself. And, I've said it in a few different instances, on the show, but I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but, in corporate, you don't really care about that stuff, and I always I'm always so surprised, and that's why I say, the word embarrassed, because how we almost expect people to be high functioning all the time. And you probably see this in your private practice, where people are talking about it from the other aspect. But, we almost create that environment where you're pushing people to the absolute limit most of the time. And I just wonder how much of that, is related now to the pandemic, because at least in the physical space, you can see when someone is breaking, but in a remote setting, sometimes you're probably not going to see that for days, if not weeks,
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's always interesting. We always expected everyone to be at that level, but I don't think we ever asked the question, can you absolutely do this? But we would see it in the results, you'd see it in the performance, you'd see it, with the missed deadlines and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say this is probably something I hear on a daily basis, if not weekly, is how, obviously with the start of the pandemic, so much had to change in how we work and how we operate. And, companies had to revert most of the time to online, work. And as you say, there's much less of that personal interaction. You don't really see you don't really see what this person is going through. You don't know what their home circumstances are. You don't actually have a clue, if you ask me, what their day-to-day looks like. And unfortunately, people experience a significant amount of stress along with that. People are pushed to their limits. I think they're expected to be these, I don't know what. I often think about it as robots or unicorns, or just some type of, far-fetched, being that we're not as humans. And it's not always possible to function at your very best. There has to be, I think, more of a consideration in the workplace of what are the effects of not just the pandemic, but the life changes that people have been going through. And what does this mean really for their ability to work, their ability to manage stress, and everything that goes along with that. So it is unfortunate, but I suppose another thing that I'm also hearing that gives me some hope is that, a lot of individuals are not as hesitant or resistant to speak about their mental health to their managers or to their company. So you would find that some companies are actually great at this. They facilitate mental health sessions with a professional. They want their employees to be functioning and coping quite okay. And there's less of that, robotic pressure on it. So I suppose that side of it does give me hope, but the negative side of it, I think, will persist still for a little while.
I love that you said that. And the only thing I would say to that is, and again, we've said this once or twice, but we said, when we as a society, and especially I'm looking at corporates now, and anyone that's, employing someone, when we at a stage where an employee can say, I can't make that meeting at 9:00 because I have an appointment with my psychologist, I would say we got there. But until we get to that stage, I don't know,
Yes.
many companies that are mature enough that they would be able to do that, or people, because you play the game, and I'm sure that's what you see with your clients as well. most of the time, yes, we want to hear that, but most of the time, I mean, there's a certain role that you're playing, whether that's, at home or at, especially in corporate, because, you do need to be a certain type of person. But, as someone that's in charge of this deadline, as an example, if I know that this person is more susceptible to being, to have an episode or something, is that, are you going to risk that, on the project? And I think that's the part. But I like what you're saying in terms of, I think there must be that higher level of social consciousness. You must know about it, so that you can make decisions. And I think if we're getting to that stage, definitely, I love that. I love the fact that people know what depression is now, and know what bipolar is, and know that actually adults can have ADHD, which I didn't know until probably 3 months ago, to be fair. I always thought it was a child thing. So all of those things. But that's the reason for doing this, and having, amazing people like yourself on board to be able to help us, understand it.
Yeah, no, it is great. I think the more we can do things like this, the better. And, research is definitely backing us up in that. They say as important as psychoeducation and awareness and all of these things are, you also find that lived experience, with individuals who suffer from this is important. So the more people are actually coming forward and sharing their diagnoses, and just kind of ignoring the possibility of stigma and talking about it, and helping other people learn from it, the better the whole situation does become. So I agree. I mean, it's lovely that we can have platforms like this, where people can actually really understand this a little bit better, take the mystery out of it, take the judgment out of it, and realize that chances are a lot of people in your life, whether it be at work, whether it be in a personal sense or in a social sense, a lot of people in your life have a condition of some sort, or more than one. And, we'd be surprised when we actually start talking about this, how it's not an uncommon, strange thing. So definitely.
No, I love this. I think we have to wrap up. It's always amazing, when we start the show and we look at the topic. It's like, okay, I wonder if there's enough to talk about for an hour, and then an hour goes by, with no issues, which is now the case. Exactly. But we do want to almost like keep it to that level, and keep it actionable and informative. But just to close off, is there anything, Lauré, on your side that I should have asked you around bipolar or depression that you think we didn't cover?
Sure. I actually think we covered all of the important parts, if you ask me. I think if we are really to have an in-depth look at bipolar and depression, we could probably do that for a week, if not more, nonstop. So you're right. That's why an hour like this can go by so quickly. I think we touched on all of the important parts. I suppose one of the take-home messages that I just always, want to give a client, or when I'm talking about these things, is, just try have self-compassion, try work on that aspect of your mental health. We're here to understand our diagnoses better and to get treatment. And, I just always encourage people to as I said earlier, not think about it as a life sentence. Think about it as a unique challenge you're going through, but millions of other people are going through it too. Try and activate those areas of support, seek out therapy, speak to a psychologist if that's possible, and just remember that there is hope in this. You just want to understand it better. And I suppose that's kind of the last 2 cents that I would put in.
Well said. I mean, I think you summarized that perfectly. And as you said, I mean, it would be crazy for us to think that we can cover everything in an hour, even 2 hours, because there's people that dedicate their lives to this stuff and research and stuff like that, and actually helping people like yourself, like you do with your clients. But what we wanted to get out of it is a sense of, because we always say Google is not your friend. Like, I don't think people would go on to Google and search for bipolar. I have bipolar. If you don't know what the term is, if you didn't watch Homeland or something, So yeah, it's like, to almost like shed that light, and then someone says, actually I did see someone, like, and it's like 4 days and he hasn't slept, like, what is it? And hopefully something like this kind of spurs them to start searching, and hopefully with the right people, and yeah, so that's
it.
so I like how you said that. And yeah, that's a wrap. But thanks very much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And I say it all the time, but we love having people like yourself on, shedding this light and information with us.
Thank you so much. This was really lovely. Thank you for your time.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. As always, stay tuned and we'll speak to you in the next episode.